Sometimes, the past holds secrets that refuse to stay buried. This is the story of a man who evaded justice for nearly 50 years, living among us, unnoticed, until a single clue cracked open a mystery that haunted a community for decades. It was a cold December evening in 1975. Lindy Sue Biechler was found brutally murdered in her own apartment. A kitchen towel wrapped around her neck, stab wounds covering her body. It was a scene that scared the entire Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Despite tireless efforts by investigators, the trail went cold. For 47 years, the case remained a chilling reminder of unanswered questions. Who would commit such a crime? And why did justice seem so out of reach? Then, in 2022, a discarded coffee cup turned everything upside down. It wasn't just a breakthrough, it was the key to a secret that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. This is a case that will leave you questioning what it truly means to escape the past. Stay with us as we unravel the shocking truth behind her murder and the man who thought he'd gotten away. Lindy Sue Biechler was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. At just 19 years old, she had her whole life ahead of her. Known for her warm smile and lively spirit, she had recently celebrated a milestone, her wedding to her high school sweetheart. The couple had just started building their future together in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a community defined by its rolling farmlands and tight-knit neighbors. It was December 5, 1975, an ordinary Friday. Lindy Sue had spent the day running errands, preparing for a quiet evening at home. She had recently moved into a cozy apartment at Spring Manor Apartments, a place where she felt safe, a place she believed would be the foundation of her dreams. But that evening, the unthinkable happened. When her husband returned home, he found a scene no one could prepare for. Lindy Sue was lying in the middle of their living room floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. She had been stabbed 19 times, her body bearing the marks of a vicious and personal attack. The sheer brutality left investigators stunned and a community grappling with shock. Draped across Lindy Sue's neck was a kitchen towel. To investigators, it was both chilling and puzzling. Was it a final act of remorse? Or an attempt to conceal the savagery of the attack? Whatever the intent, it only deepened the mystery. Neighbors described the day as eerily quiet. Some recalled hearing faint noises but nothing alarming enough to raise suspicion. Lindy Sue's apartment was in a busy complex, surrounded by people coming and going. Yet no one reported seeing anything unusual, no screams, no signs of a struggle, no suspicious figures entering or leaving. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Police arrived quickly, determined to gather every possible lead. They meticulously documented the scene, collecting evidence from the apartment, the hallway, and the surrounding area. Among the items recovered were cigarette butts near the doorway, fingerprints on surfaces, and, most importantly, traces of the killer's DNA left at the scene. But in 1975, DNA testing was a technology of the future, a tool investigators could only dream of. For now, these crucial pieces of evidence would remain stored, waiting for the day they could finally speak. Interviews with neighbors and family painted a picture of a young woman with no known enemies. Lindy Sue was kind, well-liked, and described by friends as someone who avoided conflict. Yet the violence of the crime suggested a deeply personal motive. Detectives began to wonder, could this have been a crime of passion? Or was it something entirely random? As the hours turned into days, the community was on edge. The once quiet streets now felt heavy with unease. Residents double-locked their doors, children were kept inside, and whispers of fear filled the air. For the first time, people in this close-knit town began to question each other. Who among them could commit such a heinous act? Was it someone they knew? Someone they trusted? Local news outlets covered the story relentlessly, describing the case as one of the most shocking crimes in Lancaster County's history. Vigils were held, community meetings organized, and tips poured into the police department. Everyone wanted justice for Lindy Sue, but justice, it seemed, would be agonizingly out of reach. For Lindy Sue's family, the pain was immeasurable. Her parents, who had watched her walk down the aisle just weeks earlier, now found themselves planning her funeral. Her husband, once filled with dreams of a life together, was now consumed by questions that had no answers. In the wake of her death, the community came together to honor Lindy Sue's memory. But behind the public displays of support, a question loomed larger than ever: who could have done this? And why? The investigation into Lindy Sue Biechler's murder began immediately, with detectives racing against time to gather every possible lead. Officers worked through the night, photographing the crime scene, collecting fingerprints, and bagging items for evidence. One key clue caught their attention early on: a cigarette butt discarded near Lindy Sue's doorway. It was collected and preserved, but in 1975, forensic science was still in its infancy, and this small piece of evidence could only be set aside, waiting for technology to catch up. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, questioning every resident in the Spring Manor apartments. They asked about suspicious behavior, unfamiliar visitors, and any unusual sounds heard on the night of the murder. Many neighbors reported seeing nothing out of the ordinary, though one or two recalled hearing muffled noises they had dismissed at the time as everyday disturbances. Despite the lack of clear eyewitnesses, investigators remained determined. They compiled a list of potential persons of interest, including acquaintances of Lindy Sue, her neighbors, and anyone who had access to her apartment. Rumors swirled within the community, casting suspicion in every direction. No one could be ruled out. But the trail quickly began to grow cold. Inside the crime lab, technicians worked tirelessly to analyze the physical evidence gathered from the scene. The blood-stained towel, the cigarette butt, and partial fingerprints were all carefully documented. But without the advanced DNA testing we rely on today, these items offered limited insight. Still, detectives hoped they might hold the key to solving the case, one day. Meanwhile, the community of Lancaster County remained gripped by fear. The idea that such a brutal crime could occur in their quiet town was almost incomprehensible. Residents speculated endlessly about the identity of the killer. Was it a stranger passing through, or someone who had been living among them the entire time? The lack of answers only deepened the unease. To generate leads, police worked with witnesses to create composite sketches of anyone who might have been in the area that night. Flyers were distributed, and local news outlets ran stories urging anyone with information to come forward. Yet, days turned into weeks, and the silence was deafening. No solid suspects emerged, and no one seemed to know anything definitive about what had happened that night. Detectives began revisiting Lindy Sue's life, hoping to uncover a motive. They spoke with her family, friends, and co-workers, asking the same questions repeatedly. Did she have any enemies? Was she being threatened? Was there anyone who might want to harm her? The answers were always the same. Lindy Sue was well-liked, kind, and seemingly without conflict in her life. Her family described her as happy and carefree, with no signs of distress in the days leading up to her murder. But investigators couldn't ignore the nature of the attack. 19 stab wounds suggested anger or passion. As the weeks dragged on, the case became more complicated. Tips from the public poured in, some credible, others outlandish. Police followed up on every lead, no matter how small. A strange man seen walking near the apartment complex. An unfamiliar car parked on the street. A neighbor who had reportedly acted suspiciously. Each clue led to another dead end, leaving investigators frustrated but undeterred. At a press conference held weeks after the murder, police appealed to the public for more information. "We are confident that someone out there knows something," one officer stated. "We need your help to bring Lindy Sue's killer to justice." The plea was met with an outpouring of community support but no concrete breakthroughs. As media coverage grew, so did speculation. Theories ranged from a crime of opportunity to a deeply personal act of violence. Some wondered if the killer had been watching Lindy Sue, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Others questioned if this was the work of someone she had trusted. Each theory added to the cloud of uncertainty surrounding the case. Behind the scenes, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. They reviewed every detail of Lindy Sue's daily routine, every interaction she had in the days before her murder. They examined records, followed up with acquaintances, and sought out any thread that might lead them closer to the truth. But no matter how hard they searched, the case stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. By the end of 1975, the investigation had reached a standstill. Evidence was filed away, interviews dwindled, and leads became scarce. For detectives, it was a bitter pill to swallow. For the Biechler family, it was an unbearable weight. Justice for Lindy Sue seemed as distant as ever. For decades, Lindy Sue Biechler's case remained frozen in time, her murder a haunting question that law enforcement could not answer. Investigators filed away the evidence, waiting for a moment when science might catch up with the crime. That moment arrived nearly half a century later, in 2022, when advancements in DNA technology gave new life to an investigation once considered hopeless. Among the preserved evidence from the 1975 crime scene was one critical piece, a sample of the killer's DNA. Extracted from blood and other materials, it had been stored meticulously for decades. But in the 1970s, DNA profiling as we know it didn't exist. Even by the 1980s and 1990s, while DNA testing was in its infancy, the technology lacked the sophistication required to make a significant breakthrough in Lindy Sue's case. Then came a revolutionary tool, genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA profiling, which focuses on matching a suspect's DNA to crime scene evidence, genetic genealogy goes a step further. By analyzing a suspect's DNA and comparing it to publicly available genealogical databases, investigators can construct family trees, trace distant relatives, and narrow down potential suspects. It's a painstaking process, but one that has already cracked dozens of cold cases. In 2022, the DNA evidence collected from Lindy Sue's crime scene was submitted for this groundbreaking analysis. Scientists meticulously analyzed the sample, creating a genetic profile that was then uploaded to genealogy databases. These databases, often used by individuals seeking information about their ancestry, became the unexpected key to unlocking long unsolved crimes. By comparing the crime scene DNA to these genealogical profiles, investigators began piecing together a web of familial connections. The process led them to several families, each with genetic ties to the DNA found at the scene. From there, the work of narrowing down suspects began. Detectives, working alongside genetic genealogists, cross-referenced these family connections with historical records, including marriage licenses, property deeds, and even old phone books. Their focus narrowed to individuals who lived in Lancaster County at the time of the murder, people who had proximity and opportunity. After months of analysis, one name emerged: David Sinopoli. At 68 years old, Sinopoli was living quietly in Pennsylvania. But in 1975, he had resided in the same apartment complex as Lindy Sue Biechler. The connection was impossible to ignore. Still, investigators needed more than a name, they needed direct evidence linking him to the crime. Undercover investigators began discreetly following Sinopoli, watching his daily routines and waiting for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample without his knowledge. They couldn't afford to alert him or risk compromising the investigation. Their patience paid off in an unexpected place, a local coffee shop. One day, Sinopoli discarded a coffee cup after finishing his drink. Investigators seized the opportunity, collecting the cup and sending it for analysis. Inside, they found what they had been waiting for: his DNA. When the results came back, they were definitive. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from Lindy Sue's crime scene. After 47 years, investigators had finally identified their suspect. David Sinopoli's name now became the focal point of an investigation that had spanned nearly half a century. The man who had lived quietly in Lancaster County, blending into the fabric of the community, was now under intense scrutiny. But even with the DNA match, questions remained. How had he evaded suspicion for so long? What had driven him to commit such a brutal crime? And would the evidence gathered after so many years hold up in court? Investigators knew the road ahead would be challenging. The passage of time had eroded memories, witnesses had moved away or passed on, and physical evidence was limited to what had been preserved decades earlier. Yet, with DNA technology and genetic genealogy now on their side, they were closer than ever to delivering justice for Lindy Sue Biechler. On a summer morning in 2022, nearly half a century after Lindy Sue Biechler's murder, detectives made their move. David Sinopoli, a 68-year-old man living in Lancaster County, was taken into custody. The arrest was the culmination of years of dormant hope, tireless effort, and a technological breakthrough that finally put a name to the crime. For the neighbors who watched the scene unfold, the arrest came as a shock. David Sinopoli wasn't a name anyone would have associated with murder. By all appearances, he was an ordinary man, a husband, a father, and a longtime resident of the community. He blended seamlessly into the quiet fabric of Lancaster County. But beneath that ordinary exterior lay a secret he had managed to conceal for 47 years. When questioned, Sinopoli offered little in his defense. He didn't deny the accusations outright, nor did he confess. Instead, he remained mostly silent, letting the weight of the evidence speak for itself. That evidence, however, was overwhelming, a DNA match directly tying him to the scene of Lindy Sue Biechler's brutal murder. Prosecutors built their case meticulously. The DNA recovered from the crime scene, preserved for decades, was the cornerstone of their argument. It matched Sinopoli's genetic profile with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Investigators also unearthed old records placing him in the same apartment complex as Lindy Sue at the time of the murder, further solidifying his connection to the crime. The arrest sent shockwaves through Lancaster County and beyond. Residents who had lived with the haunting memory of Lindy Sue's murder now grappled with the reality that the killer had been among them all along. For some, it was a moment of relief, a long overdue step toward justice. For others, it raised unsettling questions about how Sinopoli had managed to evade suspicion for so many years. In court, the prosecution laid out their case with precision. They highlighted the significance of the DNA evidence, explaining how genetic genealogy had led to the breakthrough. They also detailed the brutality of the crime, emphasizing the number of stab wounds and the personal nature of the attack. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was deliberate, calculated, and deeply disturbing. For Lindy Sue's family, the arrest was bittersweet. After 47 years, they finally had a name and a face tied to the horrific act that had stolen their loved one. Yet, the pain of her loss remained as raw as ever. They sat quietly in the courtroom, listening to the evidence unfold, grappling with emotions that ranged from anger to sorrow to a quiet hope for closure. Legal experts weighed in on the case, noting the challenges of prosecuting a crime so many years after it occurred. Witnesses were harder to find, memories had faded, and physical evidence beyond the DNA was limited. But the prosecution was confident that the genetic evidence would stand up to scrutiny, providing a clear and undeniable link between Sinopoli and the crime. This arrest demonstrates the power of perseverance and science, the district attorney declared. We never gave up on Lindy Sue, and today, we move closer to justice for her and her family. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and disbelief from the community. As the investigation into Sinopoli's life continued, more questions emerged. How had he managed to avoid detection for so long? Did anyone in his life suspect he was capable of such violence? And what was his motive for attacking Lindy Sue, a young woman with no known enemies or conflicts? These were questions that lingered even as the legal process moved forward. Detectives began revisiting the original case files, hoping to uncover additional details that might explain Sinopoli's actions. They analyzed his movements, relationships, and behavior in the years following the crime. Though he had no significant criminal record, his proximity to the victim and the overwhelming DNA evidence painted a clear picture of his guilt. While David Sinopoli's arrest marked a major turning point in the case, it also brought a renewed focus on Lindy Sue herself, the young woman whose life had been cut tragically short. Her family and friends reflected on her vibrant personality, her dreams, and the profound loss they had endured for nearly 5 decades. On October 19, 2023, David Sinopoli stood in a Lancaster County courtroom and pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary in connection with Lindy Sue Biechler's death. The judge sentenced him to an aggregate prison term of 25 to 50 years in a state correctional facility. Considering Sinopoli's age, the judge noted that this sentence effectively amounts to life in prison. During the sentencing, Sinopoli offered a brief apology, stating, "I would like to apologize to everyone, including my wife." His words, however, did little to assuage the grief and anger felt by Lindy Sue's family, who had waited nearly 5 decades for this moment. For the Biechler family, the sentencing brought a measure of closure, though the pain of Lindy Sue's loss can never be fully erased. Her husband, who has since remarried, addressed Sinopoli directly in court, saying, "While others had to live their life with the terrible consequences of the murder you committed, you got to live your life out. So, I have to ask you, why did you do this? While I forgive you because my God tells me to, you need to." One thing is clear: the advancements in genetic genealogy have revolutionized the way crimes are solved. Cases that seemed destined to remain cold have been reignited, giving a voice to victims long silenced. For Lindy Sue, the science behind this breakthrough not only brought a measure of justice but also illuminated the power of persistence and innovation in law enforcement. For the Lancaster community, Lindy Sue's story serves as a reminder of the fragility of life and the resilience of those left behind. Her murder not only marked a tragic loss but also revealed the enduring strength of a family determined to see justice served. While they may never know the full truth of what happened that night, they can take solace in knowing that Lindy Sue's case has finally reached its resolution, albeit decades later. Cases like Lindy Sue's highlight the importance of never giving up, of holding on to the hope that someday, answers may come. It's a testament to the tireless dedication of detectives, forensic scientists, and the evolving tools that make the impossible possible. So, what do you think about this case? Were you as surprised as we were by how it was finally solved? Do you believe justice was truly served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. We bring you the most compelling, real-life cases every week, stories that remind us of the power of truth, justice, and the relentless pursuit of answers.